Hey there, bookworms. You ready to jump into the literary world? Today, we're diving into a debate that's making waves. Is modern fiction uncool?
Ah, yes. A question that's both provocative and surprisingly complex. And believe it or not, this isn't just about personal taste. It's a reflection of the ever-evolving landscape of literature itself.
To navigate these choppy waters, we're using this YouTube video essay as our compass, and the essayist doesn't hold back. They're arguing that modern fiction has lost its cultural punch and become too inward-looking, too focused on personal struggles.
Yeah.
It's a pretty bold claim, right?
Indeed it is. But this essay, while certainly opinionated, offers a fascinating perspective on what we as a society value in storytelling today versus, say, a few decades ago.
Okay, so our mission is to unwrap these arguments and see if they hold up. What nuggets of truth can we extract, and what does this perspective reveal about the state of literature today?
Precisely. And to really understand where this essayist is coming from, it's helpful to look back at a period they consider a sort of golden age for fiction. The 1980s.
The 80s big hair, shoulder pads, and literary brawls. Because the essay paints a picture of a time when authors like Martin Amis, Salman Rushdie, and Angela Carter were practically rock stars.
It was a vibrant, even messy scene. Literature wasn't just entertainment. It was a force to be reckoned with, sparking fierce debates and reflecting the social and political upheavals of the time.
The essay even describes how authors like Martin Amis and Julian Barnes would send each other these scathing fuck-off letters. It makes the current literary scene seem tame by comparison.
Well, the comparison might be a bit exaggerated, but it does highlight how literature in the 80s was often raw, edged, and deeply intertwined with the cultural zeitgeist. And the essay argues, is something that's missing in much of contemporary fiction.
Okay, so we have this image of the 80s literary scene as this wild, untamed, but how do we get from there to where we are now? With the rise of what the essay calls trauma novels, these introspective stories focused on personal pain and identity.
It's a fascinating shift, and I wouldn't say it's entirely a negative one. Exploring suffering through storytelling can be incredibly powerful and thought-provoking.
I agree, but the essay makes me wonder, has the pendulum swung too far in that direction? Are we perhaps missing something by focusing so intently on individual struggles?
That's a question worth pondering, and it leads us to the essay's most controversial argument, which links this shift towards introspection to the changing demographics of the publishing industry.
Here's where things get a little dicey because the essay points out that the publishing industry is now predominantly female. 80% of fiction buyers are women, as are the vast majority of literary agents and those working in editorial and marketing.
Yes, those are the statistics, and they're certainly striking. But the real question is, what conclusions can we draw from this? Do these statistics point to a bias towards certain types of stories? Or are we simply observing a natural evolution of literary tastes?
Well, the essayist walks a bit of a tightrope here. They highlight the contrast between what they call masculine writing, gritty, action-packed, and feminine writing, which they characterize as more introspective.
It's a generalization, of course, and one that needs to be treated with caution. But I think the essay does raise a valid point about how the dynamics within any industry can influence the types of product, in this case, books that are produced and promoted.
That's a really interesting way to put it. So it's not necessarily about men versus women, or about assigning specific traits to each gender. It's more about acknowledging that power structures, whoever holds that power, can impact the types of stories that get told.
Precisely. And this leads us to another fascinating element in this whole debate, the rise of book talk and its growing influence on what people are reading.
Oh yeah, Book Talk, it's this massive community on TikTok where people are sharing book recommendations. And it's become a real force in the publishing world, but the essay suggests that it's contributing to a kind of homogenization of story.
The essayist points out that there's a sort of book talk formula emerging. Books that lean heavily on emotional extremes, angsty romance, and easily digestible prose. These are the books that tend to go viral on the platform. And as a result, some authors may feel pressured to adapt their writing to fit this mold.
So it's like there's this algorithm-driven pressure to write what sells, even if it means sacrificing originality or taking creative risks.
It's a concern for sure, and it ties into the essay's lament that literature has lost its appeal, especially among young men, who might be drawn to more transgressive or action-packed narratives, the kind of stories that don't necessarily fit the book talk formula.
And that's where the essay really raises some eyebrows. It criticizes school writing competitions for favoring what they consider safe and introspective themes, potentially discouraging boys from exploring edgier, more humorous, or even subversive writing styles.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? On the one hand, we want to encourage all young writers, regardless of gender, to express themselves authentically. But on the other hand, it's worth considering whether certain trends or preferences, even with the best of intentions, might be unintentionally limiting creative exploration.
That's a great point. So we've looked back at the glory days of the 80s, explored the rise of introspective fiction and the role of book talk, and even touched on the sensitive topic of gender dynamics in publishing. But I think it's time to circle back to the central question, has modern fiction truly lost its cool factor?
Well, the essayist certainly makes a compelling case, arguing that contemporary literature lacks the spark, the cultural impact, the cult of personality figures that drew previous generations to books. They even name-drop authors like Chuck Palahniuk and Irvine Welsh as examples of writers who captured the zeitgeist of their time.
Okay, but what does that even mean? What exactly is missing from modern fiction?
The essay suggests that it's a combination of factors, a lack of boldness, a reluctance to experiment with style, and perhaps a tendency to focus too narrowly on personal struggle rather than grappling with larger societal issues. And, it does make you wonder, are we lacking those larger-than-life figures, those literary rock stars, who not only wrote captivating stories, but also embodied a certain spirit of rebellion or transgression?
That's a fascinating thought. Think of someone like Hunter S. Thompson, who was as famous for his outrageous persona as he was for his writing. Do we have anyone like that today?
It's hard to say. Perhaps the very nature of celebrity has changed, or maybe we're simply in a different cultural moment where those kinds of figures don't emerge as readily, but it does make you wonder what those missing ingredients might be, and if their absence contributes to this perception of modern fiction as uncool.
And here's a question that popped into my mind while we were talking about the essayists' argument. Could this whole debate about modern fiction being uncool be in itself a kind of yearning for something more, a sign that readers are hungry for something different, something that breaks the mold?
That's a really astute observation. Maybe this declaration of uncoolness is actually a form of rebellion, a rejection of the status quo, a call for literature to once again become a force that provokes challenge, and maybe even shocks us out of our comfort zone.
I love that idea. So it's not necessarily that all modern fiction is bad or boring. It's more that there's a desire for something more, something that pushes boundaries and sparks those aha moments.
Exactly. And it's a desire that goes beyond specific genres or demographic. It's about wanting literature to be relevant, to speak to us in a way that feels both deeply personal and connected to the wider world.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation already. I'm eager to keep exploring these ideas. We've got a lot more ground to cover, including the role of chick lit and how gender dynamics might be shaping the literary landscape.
Yes, there's much more to unpack. We'll delve into those nuances and also consider what this all means for us, the readers, and what we can do to ensure that literature remains a vibrant and vital part of our culture.
Well, dear listener, stay tuned because we're just getting started.
As we're discussing this idea of modern fiction lacking a certain coolness, it's interesting to think about what even constitutes cool in literature. Is it about challenging conventions, pushing boundaries, or something else entirely?
That's a great question, and I wonder if it might be tied to this feeling of discovery, that sense of finding something unique and unexpected, like stumbling upon a hidden gem that speaks to you in a way you didn't anticipate.
I think you're onto something there. The essayist, you'll recall, had some rather pointed commentary about the prevalence of chick lit and its formulaic nature. But isn't that true of many genres?
Oh, yeah.
Think about those World War II novels that seem to dominate certain sections of the bookstore with the women on the covers always facing away. They all start to look the same after a while.
That's so true. And the essayists seemed particularly baffled by those. They even wondered why women keep buying them. But, it does make you think about the power of tropes and convention, even if they sometimes lead to a sense of predictability. Maybe that's part of the appeal for some readers, that comfort of knowing what to expect.
It's like seeking out a familiar friend, a story that feels safe and predictable. But I do think the essayist raises a valid point about the potential for formulaic storytelling to overshadow originality, particularly when it comes to genres that are often marketed towards women.
And, I'm starting to wonder if that's part of what fuels this perception of modern fiction as uncool. Is it that the stories themselves are inherently lacking, or is it more about how they're being packaged and marketed, leading to a sense of homogeneity and stability?
That's a very insightful point. The essayists seem to be particularly frustrated with this blurring of lines between literary fiction and commercial fiction, especially when it comes to books aimed at women.
I can see how that blurring might be frustrating, especially for readers who are looking for something that challenges them intellectually or pushes the boundaries of story.
It ties into those broader questions we were discussing earlier about how we define and categorize genre. Is literary fiction inherently superior to commercial fiction, or is it more about personal preference and what individual readers find meaningful?
I think it's important to remember that labels can be incredibly limiting. A book that one person might dismiss as chick lit could be deeply moving and thought-provoking for another.
Absolutely. Ultimately, it's up to each reader to decide what resonates with them, regardless of how a book is categorized or marketed.
And it strikes me that this entire debate might be less about the inherent quality of modern fiction and more about this sense of longing for something that feels fresh, groundbreaking, or even a little bit dangerous.
Perhaps it's a yearning for that spark we discussed earlier, that element of surprise or transgression that shakes things up and reminds us of the power of storytelling to challenge our assumptions and expand our horizons.
Speaking of challenging assumptions, the essay doesn't shy away from the potentially thorny issue of how gender dynamics might be influencing the literary landscape. Remember, the essayist pointed out those about the publishing industry being predominantly female.
Yes, and it led to some provocative, if somewhat risky argument. The essayist suggested that this female dominant might be contributing to a certain type of storytelling becoming the norm, one that emphasizes emotional depth and introspection, possibly at the expense of other themes or style.
And they went so far as to suggest that this might be contributing to the alienation of some male readers who feel that their interests aren't being represented.
It's a touchy subject, and it's important to approach it with nuance and avoid sweeping generalization. But I think it does raise a valid point about how power dynamics within any industry, not just publishing, can shape what gets produced and promoted.
It's a reminder that diversity of voices and perspectives is crucial not only in the stories being told, but also in the people who are making decisions about which stories get published and how they're presented to the world.
Precisely. And if we want literature to be truly representative of our society, we need to ensure that a wide range of stories are being told and that those stories are reaching a diverse audience.
Okay, so we've talked about genre marketing and the complexities of gender dynamics in publishing, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the power of platforms like Book Talk and how they're shaping what people read.
Yes, Book Talk. It's this incredible phenomenon. And as much as the essayist expressed some concerns about its potential to homogenize storytelling, it's undeniable that it's also given a voice to many authors and genres that might have been overlooked by traditional publishing.
It's a fascinating example of how social media can disrupt established power structures and create new opportunities for diverse voices to be heard. And it makes me think about this tension between catering to algorithms and staying true to your creative vision as an author.
That's a crucial tension, and one that many authors are grappling with today. On the one hand, Book Talk has created this incredible platform for connecting readers with books they might never have encountered otherwise.
But on the other hand, there's this pressure to conform to what's trending, to write what sells, even if it means sacrificing originality or taking risks.
It's a tricky balance for sure, and it makes you wonder about the long-term implications for literature. Will this focus on trends and algorithms stifle creativity? And lead to a more homogeneous literary landscape? Or will it ultimately broaden the scope of what's considered good literature and create space for new voices and perspectives?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but it's a conversation worth having as we navigate this new era of digital influence and algorithmic recommendation.
You know, as we've been dissecting this essay and exploring all these different angles, it struck me that the answer to this question of whether modern fiction is uncool might be more complex than a simple yes or no.
I'm starting to think so too. It's not necessarily about modern fiction being inherently bad or boring. It's more about this sense of searching, of wanting something, something that pushes boundaries, sparks our imagination, and maybe even challenges our assumptions a bit.
Perhaps this whole debate is a symptom of a deeper yearning for literature to reclaim its role as a cultural force, something that sparks conversations, provokes thought, and helps us make sense of the complexities of the world around us.
I love that idea. So maybe this isn't a lament for the good old days of literature, but rather a call to action, an invitation to rediscover the power of storytelling and to demand more from the books we read.
Precisely. And that brings us to the crucial question: what can we as readers do to ensure that literature remains a vibrant and vital part of our culture? How can we foster that sense of discovery, that coolness that we seem to be craving?
Well, that sounds like the perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore those questions and more, so stay tuned, dear listener. All right, so we've spent a good chunk of time dissecting this whole argument, like, is modern fiction uncool? We've looked back at the 80s, we've talked about trauma novels, Book Talk, gender dynamics. It's a lot to process, but the huge question remains, where do we go from here? What can we as readers do to make sure that literature is still, exciting, and cool?
It's a fantastic question, and one that I think requires us to be both introspective and proactive. On the introspective side, I think it's about recognizing our own reading habits and biases. Are we stuck in a rut, gravitating towards the familiar and predictable? Are we letting algorithms make our choices for us? Or are we actively seeking out diverse voices and stories that challenge our perspective?
That's a great point. It's so easy to get caught in a loop, especially with all those recommendations and targeted ads online. But stepping outside of our comfort zones can lead to some amazing discoveries.
Absolutely.
Really.
It's like exploring a new city. You could stick to the tourist traps, or you could venture off the beaten path and find those hidden gems that truly capture the spirit of the place. And I think the same applies to literature.
I love that analogy. So venturing off the beaten path, that's the introspective part. What about the proactive side? How can we actively contribute to a more vibrant and diverse literary landscape?
Well, I think it starts with being more intentional about the books we choose to read, supporting independent bookstores, seeking out authors from marginalized communities, exploring genres we might not typically gravitate towards. These are all small but meaningful steps we can take.
And what about amplifying the voices of those authors we could connect with? I mean, we've seen how powerful word of mouth can be, especially with platforms like Book Talk. Sharing our passion for a book, writing reviews, recommending it to friends, those actions can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And I think it's also about engaging in thoughtful discussions about the books we read, like we're doing right now, not just summarizing the plot, but really digging into the themes, the writing style, the impact the story has on us.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because sometimes I think we're so quick to judge a book as good or bad just based on did I enjoy this? And we forget about the bigger picture. How does this book contribute to the literary conversation? What does it say about the world we live in? Exactly. It's about recognizing that literature is more than just entertainment. It's a reflection of our culture, our values, our hopes and fears. And by engaging with it thoughtfully, critically, and with an open mind, we can help shape future of storytelling.
So it's not just about finding those cool books. It's about becoming more active participants in the literary ecosystem.
That's a brilliant way to put it. It's about becoming more conscious consumers and advocates for the kind of literature we want to see flourish.
And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I can't help but think about that essayist's lament, about how modern fiction is lacking that spark. It's made me realize that maybe we're all yearning for that spark in different ways.
I think you're right. We all have our own definition of what makes a book truly captivating. And it's that diversity of tastes and preferences that keeps the literary world so dynamic. And
so if you're listening to this and you're feeling kind of disillusioned with modern fiction, don't give up. There are so many incredible stories out there waiting to be discovered. Just remember to stay curious, keep exploring, and be open to new experiences.
And perhaps most importantly, don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions about what makes good literature. You might be surprised by what you find when you venture beyond the familiar and embrace the unexpected.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to write the next Uncool novel that shakes things up and redefines what's possible in storytelling.
It's certainly possible, and that's the beauty of art.
Yeah.
It's constantly evolving, pushing boundaries, and challenging us to see the world in new ways.
What a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the sometimes choppy, always fascinating waters of the literary world.
It's been a pleasure navigating these currents with you, and to all you listeners out there, keep reading, keep exploring, and keep those conversations flowing.
Until next time, happy reading, everyone.